This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Let me remind you of a few things concerning just the mechanics of the way our class is to be set up. The first thing I would remind you of is that before you begin watching the video, you should read through the chapter that we're going to be studying at this particular time before you watch the video. The reason for that is because, first of all, you need to be a little bit familiar with it as we go through, because I am not going to be going through every single phrase and every paragraph in the book. As a matter of fact, I'll be skipping some. And then you need to also be familiar with the overall purpose of the chapter so that you'll be able, as we go back to emphasize things and give supplementary material, be able to fit it in to the section that it goes in. I would like for you then to turn to page 321 in your textbook. It doesn't have a page at the top of it itself, but that's where we begin, chapter 18. And we're going to be talking about the languages of the Bible. This is a very mechanical kind of thing. These first two chapters are introductory, and assuming that you have read chapter 18 already, you know that this is something that sounds like, well, why do we even need to study about this? We're really talking about how the Bible came from God to us. Well, you need to know the languages that were used by God through men in order to really teach these things to the people at the time and to make it understandable. Before we get into the chapter, though, I'd like to just read a quotation from Brother J.D. Thomas's book, Heaven's Window, because I do not want you to get so wound up in the things of these technical kinds of, the technical things that we're talking about, that you forget this. Listen to what he said. The nature of the Bible itself, the story of how it was produced, the fact of supernatural power being exercised in its production, although all interesting and important, must not distract us from the message wherein lies the power and the purpose of the revelation. And I want you to remember that. When you're studying something like languages of the Bible, you begin to think about, well, the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek and all of these kinds of things. Don't ever get so far into that you forget the message of the Bible. So let's look back in the text at the introductory material here. And I'd like for us just to remember what we've done so far. We, for example, have started out with the inspiration of the Bible. We talked about the evidences of the inspiration. We talked about what inspiration is. Then in the middle section of where we are right now, or where we were, is canonization. And that's how the Bible came to be the form that it is. When God first wrote those books through men that He chose, it was recognized as God's Word. But over the years, because of time and space and other things, people forgot which ones, and they had to go back again and do the same thing that those folks did when they first received those books in order to discover what God had given as His inspired Word. Now we're moving on to another section. The Bible is inspired. We know what books are and what books are not in the Bible. Now, how did, from the first century, or even going back to the Old Testament, from way back there at Moses and Job's time, how did that Bible get preserved and get copied and preserved up to our very time today? I'd venture to say that many of you have actually been in a conversation with someone, and they would say, well, how do we know that what we have in the Bible today is anything like they had in the first century or back during Moses' time? And if you have, then this section, this whole section, chapters 18 through 26, will be what you want to show them. I get discouraged sometimes with people who ask a question like that, and my answer to them is always, how much time do you have? They don't really want to spend 8 or 9 chapters studying this. They want an answer like that. But I think you'll see when we go through this material that we're starting now that this will answer that question quite adequately. So let's go back again to page 321, and we'll start with the first Roman numeral there. Why did God choose written languages? Now, obviously, God himself did not say why he chose them, but I believe that we can see some things that are very logical as to why God would have wanted to use that. In the first section under there, you note that it's what God could have used. And when you look back through the Old Testament, you'll find that sometimes God spoke through angels. But really, when you think about that, just as he explains in the text, if God only spoke through angels, that means that every single time he wanted to communicate something to anybody in any century, in any country, have to send another angel. Now, that's not a problem for God. It's not a problem for angels. As a matter of fact, your textbook at the top of page 322 calls it an endless invasion, and I guess that's what you could refer to. But that's not the way God wanted to always operate. If he had wanted to, he would have done so. But he chose not to do that. You'll also look in the Old Testament, and you'll find, as well as the New, that visions and dreams would be another way that God has communicated to man. But you see, there were some problems with that. If you look down about 5 lines in that chapter, or in that paragraph, you'll see that visions and dreams tend to be subjective. What if I told you I had a vision last night, and God told me, and you'd say, well, how do I know you had the vision? Maybe you just ate some sort of food that disagreed with you, and I don't know if that was really a vision that you had from God or not. And so that is a problem. And then notice also in the next line in that same paragraph, even there, and he calls it ecstatic. I think that's a dangerous word to use with inspiration, but the impact could wear off and be forgotten. I believe a great example of that for us is Peter. Peter, you remember, had this dream, and he saw this sheet let down, and there were all kinds of animals on it. This was his God's way of getting Peter to recognize that animals that in the Old Testament had been unclean were now clean, but really the point was that he should go to the Gentiles, and it's all right for them to have the same message that the Jews did. But you see, when you read in Galatians, just a few years after Peter had this miraculous vision, this miraculous dream, he was the one who withdrew from associating with the Gentiles. Paul had to withstand him face to face, you may remember. And so that is not probably the best way that God could have through all the centuries communicated because of these kinds of problems. Well, another thing on your text there on page 322 were the Urim and the Thummim. Sort of overpronounce those a little bit if you're not familiar with those words. And we don't really know what those were. In the textbook, Essentials of Bible History, the author says, just what these were and how they were employed can only be conjectured, for the Old Testament gives no definite information. The ephod, that was what the priest wore, may have been a ritual container, perhaps a sort of waistcoat, in the pockets of which the Urim and Thummim were kept. The Urim and Thummim may have been, notice that, may have been, flat stones of which one side was darker than the other, or possibly with some sort of inscription on one side. If both fell with the brighter side up, or the inscribed side up, it would mean an affirmative answer. If both of the other sides turned up simultaneously, then the answer would be negative. And if one of each, no answer was implied. Now, I read that very slowly, and I'd like to make a little side point here, and I don't want to say this all the way through these 9 chapters, but we'll be having various outside sources. I'll try to give them, as I did on this one, Essentials of Bible History, page 131. Not for you to necessarily go to that book, but just so that you'll know where the material is from. And I'm going to give them slowly like that so that if you want to go back, rewind the tape, copy it down, then you would have time to do so. I realize I could read it a lot faster, but perhaps this will be an advantage to you. If you don't want to go back and copy it, then of course you do not have to do so. But the Urim and the Thummim, we do not know exactly what purpose they served. It seemed that they only gave a yes or no answer. Well, let's look at the fourth one. That would be the moral and the creation law. Now, stay with me on this just a little bit. Look at the first part. God has revealed himself by the moral law written in the heart. Now, Romans 2:15 talks about that a little bit, but let me even go a little different direction from that. One of the evidences for the existence of a supreme being has to do with this very moral law. Human beings throughout all history have always had a sense of right and wrong. Now, quickly, I know you're thinking, well, then everybody is not doing right. Well, it isn't always God's right. Take people who are in prison. They may be in prison because they robbed a bank. But you let someone steal something from them, and they know that's wrong. And so there is a universal sense of right and wrong, and that argues for the existence of not only a supreme being who put that into us when he built us, but a supreme being who has a right and wrong concept. And so that's what we're referring to about the moral law. In Carl F.H. Henry's book, Christian Personal Ethics, page 159 and following, a summary of some of the things that he says in that is this: the form of ethics given as a universal and necessary structure of human experience accounts for the universal conviction that the distinction between right and wrong, good and bad, is a genuine one, and that it is not merely a matter of personal prejudice. Then we go back to the Hebrew Christian ethic, the Old Testament, New Testament ethic, is transcendently revealed. Its source, the thing that causes the Jews and the Christians who read the Old Testament, the New Testament, to see that there is a right and an absolute wrong, its source is a special divine disclosure to man. In contrast with the ethics of human insight and speculative genius, in other words, just trying to figure out what's wrong by human wisdom, Christian ethics is the ethic of a revealed religion. We do not have to guess what God says is right, what is wrong. From this source, it gains an eternal and absolute quality. It communicates to man commands and norms, standards, that are unaffected by society or by the time or by the place. Today it seems very popular that there is a thing called situation ethics. In other words, I won't lie unless I need to. You see, that means a person believes that it's wrong to lie, but on certain occasions he will. Well, in the moral standard, the built-in moral standard, God has said, no, lying is wrong, even if it is at your own expense. To tell the truth, you need to tell the truth. Well, that's the first thing about the moral law, but the other one is creation. In Psalm 19, the psalmist talks about how the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth is showing all the things that God has done and his creative power. In Romans, the first chapter, verse 20, it particularly talks about two things that are very, very special that show that God exists. Number one is his eternal power, and number two is his divine nature. And what that means is that when you look around the universe, you ought to be able to figure out that there is a power out there that is eternal. It is bigger than anything than man could do, or all men together. We've got 5.6 something billion people on the face of the earth. Let's see all 5.6 billion of those people get together and make a galaxy. You know, they cannot do that. So your mind says there's got to be something outside of man, and it's more powerful than all of man put together. And the other thing is his divine nature. You know he has to be something different from human, from mankind. And so we call that divine. You know, there's something else in that verse, and I realize we're not on Christian Evidences as such, but I'd like for you to notice what the first part of that verse says. Romans 1, verse 20. If you want to look that up, you can do so. But it talks about the fact that from the beginning of creation, these things, this eternal power and divine nature of God, these invisible qualities of God, have been clearly seen. Now my question is, who saw them? That must mean from the very beginning of creation, just 6 days later, man was there. You see, that's a whole lot different than saying billions and billions of years ago, a hydrogen atom got started going too fast, and then finally, a few thousands of years ago, or a few 100,000 years ago, man came on the scene. No, God created the world, like He said in Genesis 1 and 2, a few thousand years ago, and man, 6 days after he started doing that, saw this invisible power, this invisible quality of eternal power and divine nature of God. And that's a little side thing. It's not really in this section, but I believe it's very useful for us from that verse. Now let's go down to number 5 here. The audible voice and direct miracle. One of the things that I try to do as I go through Geisler and Nix, if I believe that Geisler and Nix have either misstated something or gone too far in some area, or perhaps have something that is biblically wrong, I'll try to point that out. I hope that I've not missed any so far. If I have, I'd appreciate hearing about it, because I always want to point these out. But I'd like for you to notice in the middle of that paragraph where he talks about that's not the way that God would want to do, speak to one man on one occasion for a specific purpose, and then do it again to the next man, the next man, the next man, forever and ever. It says, nevertheless, it would be a strain on the divine economy to expect a repeat performance of these feats in speaking to men everywhere. No, it really wouldn't. I mean, if you understand what an all-powerful God is, there's no strain on the divine economy to do anything. But I know what he's saying. What he's saying is that you would have to repeat a miracle every single time you wanted to communicate any kind of fact at all. And so you may want to just mark out the word strain, or question that, or note that in your textbook. It wouldn't be a strain for God. It would be something that would be continuing on, however. But he did speak to men at various times in the past, and those were miraculous kinds of things that he did. And that's why it's inspired. It's from God to man. So in this section, we've seen how God in the past, as Hebrews 1:1 talks about, did speak to man. Let's look on page 323 now. What God did choose to use. And to note at the very top in this first paragraph here, he's going to talk about the fact that language in anybody's country is not perfect. There is no way that you have even understood exactly everything that I have been saying exactly the way that I meant it. Or if you read through, just as we got through reading about the strain on the divine economy here, I don't know how Geisler Nix meant that, because when you say something in a language, by the very fact, it means it is very difficult for everyone to understand that exactly correctly. And so if you'll go down with me about 6 lines into that paragraph, you'll notice he says, it is incongruous, which means it doesn't fit. It is incongruous that scholars who raise a voice against the adequacy of language have found language adequate enough to convey their view that language is not adequate. Now what he's saying here, and that's a very good point, there are some people who say, well, God wouldn't have used just language to communicate His will. He would have done something else. But they find it adequate enough to use a language to say that God didn't use a language to communicate with. So it's kind of a silly argument that they make there. I think that's adequately refuted. And might note also from Brother Ed Wharton's book, Christianity, A Clear Case of History, he says, let me ask you this. If miracles did happen, and those who saw these miracles wanted to tell us about them, how could they have given their report with more authority and credibility than the New Testament writers did? Well, that has to be answered. When someone says Jesus fed 5,000 men, it doesn't take a lot of interpretation to understand what that says. And so for us to question those kinds of things and saying, well, actually language is not adequate to reveal God's Word. Again, we have to go back to the idea that, you mean you're telling me in language that language is not adequate to communicate? I think we have a little problem there. Let's go down to this first. There are three things that are going to be the reason that God chose language that are obvious to us anyway. Number one is precision. Obviously, it is the very best thing that we know of that God could use, other than the things that He's used in the Old Testament that He apparently chose not to use forever, would be a language, because you can precisely state something and that can be precisely understood by other people. So if you look at about the third line up from the bottom of the page, the proof of that point is the fact that mankind's most treasured knowledge, you look at all the books there are today, is in the form of written records in books. So we understand that man can communicate in a precise way, exactly to the very best of his ability anyway, what he wants to. Well, think how much better God can do that to man. Now, number two is called propagation. And of course, this just means that it's easy to pass it on from generation to generation to generation. From the time Job wrote in perhaps 2000 BC, to the time Moses wrote in perhaps 1400 BC, to the time that Paul wrote from perhaps 45 to about 70 or 68 AD, or whatever time it was, up till today. Propagation is a very good thing. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the game called gossip. Now, what this game, and this is what it's referring to here in the latter part of the paragraph, that many people have done this sort of thing. But let me just, if you've got somebody else there in the room, you can't use it with them because they're hearing what I'm saying. But maybe write this down, and then you tell it secretly to one person. Just whisper it to them. Let them tell it to someone else and someone else. And do this through about 8 people and see what the last one comes up with. Here is the sentence. Once upon a time, there were 3 ferocious-looking German shepherds strolling through the park, wondering when they would find something to eat. All of a sudden, there it was, they had a bone to pick. Now just tell that to someone else. You'll have to go back and get it off the tape. But tell that to someone else. And after the 8th person has heard that whispered in his ear, without repeating it, just one time, see what you come out with. I think you'll find why God chose a written language, because it is going to be exactly the same way 500 years from now when you read that manuscript as it was the day it was written down. You don't have to pass it on from one person to the next person to the next person. And now at the top of page 324, turn the page, we have preservation. Now it's true that all material things are going to be getting old and wearing out. And whether it's paper, as we have today, or whether it was papyrus, as they had in the old time, or even leather, or even other writing materials, which we'll talk about a little later, there's always a problem with that. But it lasts a lot longer than a person's life. And if you've ever talked to your dad, or your granddad, or his father, way back there, 2 or 3 generations, and tried to pass a story on, you know it's very hard to preserve a story accurately. We have over 70 accounts of the worldwide flood of Noah's time. But the only one that is accurate as to what really happened is the one that was written down by Moses for us to read centuries and millennia later. These others were all perverted with various gods and various people and various hills and various sizes of boats and everything else that were in there. Not at all like the real event occurred. And so the preservation of something written down certainly is much better. Now he explains a little bit here in the bottom part of the paragraph. If you'll go down about 6 or 8 lines with me where it says a written record. A written record has one additional advantage as well, namely it can stimulate memory and conjure up within the individual's imagination a host of personal implications that are latent within the given symbols or words of that record. When I first read that, I thought, I wonder if everybody understands what he's saying there. What he's saying is, in the way that I would express it anyway, would be when you read God's Word again and again and again and again and again, you're going to come up 5 years from now with an application of that to you that you didn't even think of 5 years ago. And I'd venture to say that most of you who are Bible students have done that. For example, when Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, well, how do we apply that? Does that mean that each one of us has to go individually? Well, the Philippians didn't, as far as we know, and yet Paul complimented them on giving him support for his work, and he says, you've had fellowship with me in preaching the gospel from the very first day and of that particular work. And so they themselves did not go, but they were going into all the world through Paul, the money they had given him, to help him do that. Or maybe today it might be the video. Going into all the world, sending out these videotapes all over the world is another application of that. Didn't have that a couple of 100 years ago, but we do today. Or perhaps it's sending out tracts. Many of us have known of people who took a tract and gave it to someone and they threw it away and someone else picked it up and read it and was converted by the information from the Gospels that was in that. Well, see, we've done this, but we've done it in various ways. And so I believe that's what he's saying about this preservation concept, that you can preserve it and you get more and more and more and more as you go through reading it again and again, rather than just hearing it one time. Well, that completes that particular section there. You have the 3 things, though, the precision, the propagation, and the preservation. All 3 of those are advantages. Now, if you were in my class, I would just make a comment about, that'd be a really good test question, wouldn't it? But number 2, we're going to look at now on page 324, and that is, which languages did God choose? Well, certainly we can look quickly into the Bible itself and find the answer to that. But let's look at this section right here. First of all, when we go back to the Bible, we find that the confusion of languages happened at the Tower of Babel. Matter of fact, Jones, in his book, The Empires of the Bible, on page 5, says the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel and consequent dispersion of men into nationalities occurred in the days of Peleg, the great-great-grandson of Shem. Well, certainly that's a significant thing for us, because it really would be nice, it seems, if everyone spoke just one language. You go anywhere in the world and talk to people and would have no language problem. But because of what people were doing back then, God was seeing that they were not doing what He told them to do when they could all speak the same language. It is interesting, isn't it, that on the day of Pentecost, all these various languages came together, and because of the ability that God gave the apostles to speak in various languages, each one of those people heard in his own language, the language that the apostle was speaking. Those that didn't understand them thought they were drunk, but they could go on down the line and then say, hey, this guy's speaking my language. How did this Galilean ever learn that? And so certainly God has both divided the languages, and then He made it in the first century possible for people to speak in all those languages to get the gospel out into all the world. Well, look at this first little section here, the little introduction to this paragraph or to this section. It says, having discussed why God chose to commit His truth to men by way of writing, it is only natural to examine the languages He chose. Ostensibly, it could be expected that He who works all things after the counsel of His will, and who brought forth Christ when the fullness of time came, would have chosen languages that were particularly suited to the purpose of His revelation. Yes, that's exactly what we would expect. When God was having His will revealed to men, who recorded it for us to read later on, He chose languages that those people were in, that they understood, so that it would best communicate the thought to them. We're going to see that as we go through the rest of this chapter. I might note for you right here that in our reality, we're just going to survey this. I do not think that unless you are a linguist, are really interested in this kind of thing, that we need to spend a great deal of time in these details, but I do think it's important for you to see where they came from, and that's the only purpose that we want to try to serve in this. Before we get into that next section there, the Old Testament languages, let me read to you from a couple of authors here. The Semitic languages, and I'll explain that in a minute, and dialects were spoken in an area, and you need to understand this, extending from the Caspian Sea, that would be up around what is now Turkey, to the Horn of Africa, the very bottom part of Africa, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Tigris Valley. So these languages that we're talking about here in this section, are the ones that we're going to be talking about, are very widespread in this whole, quote, Bible lands, and even beyond some of the areas that we actually read about in the Bible. So let's go down here to the Semitic family. In order for you to understand that word, it's really not very hard. We, matter of fact, implied it a little bit ago when we talked about someone who was the great-great-great-grandson of Shem. If you look at the word Semitic and the word Shem, you'll see that that just means the languages that came from Shem. And in English, we drop out the H. For example, the word Sabbath, our word Sabbath, in Hebrew is the word Shabbath. And so a lot of languages, you'll find a letter left out that's a little easier to pronounce, and with it left out. So we do that for this. But you'll notice that our text notes that both Ham's language, that's the word here, Hamitic, in about the third line down, and Semitic, so from Shem and Ham, there are some interrelations here. And so we want to be sure to note these. And if you'll look down with me about 5 lines down, the languages that were in North Africa, those were finally called Coptic. Now you don't need to remember that right now, but later on you will when we get to a number of the actual versions, because there were a number of Coptic versions. And then Berber, that's not just a carpet, Berber dialects of North Africa, and various Cushite dialects. Now if you look at the bottom of that paragraph, it says the Semitic group of languages includes 4 divisions. That's what we're going to spend just a few minutes on right now. The first one is called the Eastern Division, and really includes just one main language, and that's Akkadian. It was divided into slightly different dialects of both Babylonia and Assyria, and it was written in cuneiform. Now don't worry about that word right now. If you don't know what that means, we're going to show you a little bit later, and you have some in your text. If you've read your chapter, you know already. But this started back about 2500 BC. Akkadian was the regular language that was spoken in the Middle East until it was actually supplanted by Aramaic in about the 8th century BC. Well, let's look at your text. At the bottom of page 324, Akkadian, called Assyrian in the periods of the oldest text, and later Babylonian are spokesmen of this division. Now, if you'll look at if you've read the rest of this section, then you know that over in Babylonia and in the Assyrian empires, this is the area over to the east of the Mediterranean Sea, way over to the east of that. That's where we're talking about there. Those were the languages there. But these languages of Assyria and Akkadian were not used in the Bible writings. Let's go to the southern division. This division has 2 major languages, Arabic and Ethiopic. Neither of those is used in the Bible. But I would like for you to note about the fourth line down, Arabic is the most widely spoken Semitic language in the world today. And so it is an important language, it's just one that's not used in the Bible. Then if you look at the third one there, the northern division, this is the Amorite, and the Amorite language was not used in the Bible, but the Aramaic was. Now this one affects the Bible. As a matter of fact, Aramaic was the normal language of Palestine when Jesus and the disciples were teaching there. Aramaic was not used in the writing of the Old Testament except, and if you look in your text, I know you'll want to mark these and look them up. We're not going to do so. You can look them up yourself. Obviously, if you don't have the Hebrew, you would not notice that they were Aramaic anyway. But Genesis 10, Genesis 31, 2 Kings 18, and then Ezra 4:7 through 6:1, and then 7 and 12 through 26, Isaiah 36:11, Jeremiah 10:11, and Daniel 2:4 through Daniel 7:28. Now that's Aramaic, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on, but this is a whole wide family, Aramaic family. It's usually divided into the eastern and the western branches. The eastern was the one that was more used by the Syrians and the Christians later on, and the western was more the biblical Aramaic that was found in these passages here that you read. And we will talk a little bit about that later, but right now let's look at the northwest division, because this division of the Semitic family includes the Canaanite subdivision, as well as Aramaic elements. And it's represented by 4 dialects. Ugaritic, not used in the Bible. Phoenician, not used in the Bible. Then Lot's descendants, Moabites and Ammonites, not used in the Bible. However, there's a very important discovery. And if you'll turn with me, just hold your finger here a minute, turn with me over to page 335. That'll be in the next chapter, and we'll talk about it again when we get there. But this is a picture of the Moabite stone. You'll see it's in the Oriental Institute Museum, and it's taken from the Louvre. And we'll go back now over to page 325 and read with me the bottom 2 lines. The Moabite stone that comes from 850 BC is the first long inscription of any Canaanite language that has been discovered, found in 1868 at Dibon. Dibon is over east of the Dead Sea, and is the account of the Moabite king Mesha concerning the revolt mentioned in 2 Kings 1. So we have a historical document on stone that confirms the historical document in 2 Kings 1. Sometimes it seems that people who want to challenge the Bible all the time as being accurate have to have something like that before they'll ever believe the Bible. We believe the Bible to be true because of all the evidences that we have, because God spoke it. But when we have something like this, that just helps us to have our faith confirmed in it. I'd also like for you to notice that with Aramaic is sometimes a language classified as Northwest Semitic. The modern scholars have called that. Geisler-Nix have identified it in a similar way. But it includes these other 3 languages, Ugaritic, Phoenician, and Canaanite, and Hebrew and Moabite come from this area here. The oldest attested member of this group is probably Eblaic. Now that is an adjective based upon the word Ebla, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. But we know that Ebla, an area up about 250 miles to the north of Jerusalem, was an area back in 2500 BC that had alphabetic writing, and it was in the Semitic style of writing. And we have also, in addition to that, we have some fragments from Sinai inscriptions, And we also have Aramaic records that date back to the 10th century BC. This last information was from Gleason Archer, Survey of Old Testament Introduction. And so let me tell you that this is a very significant area here. And of course, now we're coming down to the Hebrew. So let's look at this. This is the last one in this section. Hebrew is by far the most important language of the Old Testament. Most of the Old Testament is written in it. It is called Judean as a language in 2 Kings 18:26-28, and it's also called the language of Canaan in Isaiah 19:18. Except for the portions that we just quoted from above here in Geisler Nix, all the rest of the Old Testament is in Hebrew. During its long history, Hebrew has developed into the biblical, the Mishnaic, and that's just an adjective built upon the word Mishnah, and we'll talk about the Mishnah later. The rabbinic is the teachers of the law, medieval, the period of time called medieval period, and then modern dialects of Hebrew. In Unger's Introductory Guide to the Old Testament, he says about the origin of Hebrew, Hebrew takes its origin from the Old Phoenician alphabet. It is of singular significance, moreover, that this early Sinai Hebrew script, as it is sometimes called, was found in the very region where Moses was told to write. But Old Hebrew goes back before the time of Moses and the Egyptian sojourn to the patriarchal age. Old Hebrew, sometimes called Paleo-Hebrew, is practically the same as Phoenician. It is apparently reflected in the traditional name of Hebrew, the language of Canaan, and is indicated by early Canaanite and Hebrew inscriptions. This is on pages 118, 119, Unger, Introductory Guide to the Old Testament. Well, we've seen now the basic idea of where the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and some of these others have come from. In our next lesson, we'll start here with, on page 326, number B, and we'll look at the New Testament languages.